Aisha Monroe, 32 years old, stood amidst the crowd at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta, gripping her daughter Nia's hand tightly. The road ahead of them was long and full of challenges, but every step they took was a mark of resilience that could not be erased. The hurried footsteps, the clattering of rolling suitcases, and the announcements blended into an unending symphony. The crowd moved quickly, but Aisha and Nia slowed down, as if they were important characters in a much bigger story. Aisha looked up at the flight information screen, seeing that her flight was about to depart. Each passing second felt like a challenge within her. Before, it was not just a simple flight, it was a journey to find hope. After years of fighting for justice in Georgia, Aisha had finally found an opportunity to rebuild her life, a job in Seattle, where she could truly work with people who respected her for her talent, not the color of her skin. This was a job she had long dreamed of, after life and work at the hospital had drained her from the endless battles. Her new job was a chance to start over, not just for herself but also for her daughter Nia, a 6-year-old girl, innocent yet strong in her mother's footsteps. She smiled at Nia, her gaze filled with love. Though the old duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her daughter's worn-out shoes weren't the most prestigious items, Aisha knew she was carrying a journey and a promise for the future. The beads of sweat on Aisha's forehead weren't just from the scorching August heat outside, but from the worries rising within her. She knew that no matter how far she rose, there would always be judgmental glances, the silent questions asked every time she entered a space. She had become used to the disdainful looks, the pointed remarks, and the discrimination she had to endure. But today, with every step she took in this airport, Aisha didn't feel tired anymore. It had been enough, and today, she wouldn't let anyone defeat her. When they reached the security checkpoint, Aisha had to face a woman standing next to her. The woman's eyes scanned Aisha from head to toe, her face full of contempt and scrutiny. Aisha could feel the coldness in that gaze, the judgment that this woman directed at her, simply because of her clothes and Nia's appearance. But Aisha didn't look back, not allowing that look to blind her. She knew who deserved respect. She knew where she was going, and no one could stop her journey. As she passed through the security checkpoint, Aisha felt a pang in her heart. A few people around her looked at her with curious eyes, and some passed by without a second glance. But she didn't care about them. Aisha continued forward, gripping Nia's hand tightly as they walked through the crowd. Every step mattered. This wasn't just a regular flight. It was an opportunity to prove that she deserved to be in places like this, worthy of what she had already achieved and what she would still achieve. At the check-in counter, Aisha handed her boarding pass to the attendant for verification. She received a glance from the attendant and a half-hearted greeting. "Have a pleasant flight." But Aisha didn't need those words. She just needed to be in Seattle, where everything would change. As she walked through the door to board the plane, all her worries seemed to fade away. She knew she had to keep fighting, but today, at least, she could breathe a little easier. She had come a long way. As Aisha and Nia climbed the stairs onto the plane, they paused before entering the cabin. Other passengers quickly passed by, carrying sleek handbags and expensive outfits. Aisha could feel their gazes, some assessing, some ignoring her. But she didn't care. She held Nia's hand firmly and led her daughter to their seats. This was just the beginning. The plane was preparing for takeoff, and Aisha knew they would face many challenges on this journey. But one thing was certain: she would never turn back. If you stand for justice and want to witness Aisha's journey, don't forget to like, comment, to let us know you're following. And subscribe so you won't miss any part of this dramatic story. As Aisha sat down and Nia turned around to smile at her, she knew their lives would never be the same again. But the big waves were waiting, and she had to be ready to face them. The faint light outside the window wasn't just hope. It was a battle that would soon ignite. The plane began to roll down the runway, a gentle breeze from the window causing Aisha's hair to flutter lightly. She looked out the window, watching as the city of Atlanta grew smaller, the yellow lights gradually fading behind her. The sense of peace she felt at that moment was a rare one amidst the stressful life Aisha was living. She wanted to believe that this would be a journey of change, a brighter future, but deep down, Aisha knew that this battle would never be easy. Nia had fallen asleep beside her, her small body curled up in the seat, her head resting against Aisha's shoulder. Aisha's hand gently stroked her daughter's head, each movement filled with love but also a quiet strength. For Aisha, Nia was the only reason she kept fighting. Every step she took wasn't just for herself, but for her daughter, someone she never wanted to see endure the injustices Aisha had suffered. Even though the plane had taken off and was now entering the clouded sky above, Aisha knew that the storm in her life wouldn't calm down easily. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to let go of all her worries in this moment. But the reality was, a storm was waiting for her ahead, and it began when a voice from behind broke the silence in the cabin. "Excuse me, could you spare a moment?" Aisha opened her eyes and looked toward the flight attendant, standing just a few steps away, Karen Whitlock. Aisha immediately noticed the coldness in Karen's eyes, the aloofness she had grown accustomed to over the years of living in this society, a gaze that judged not just appearance, but the very dignity of a person. Aisha tried not to let it bother her, but Karen didn't stop staring at her, as if waiting for a reaction. Aisha stood up, a hint of tension building in her chest. She bent down to grab her duffel bag and began making her way to the narrow aisle. She didn't understand why something so small made her feel so heavy. She told herself that this wasn't the time to stand up against injustice, but Karen's looks and attitude made Aisha feel suffocated. Karen didn't let up. "This isn't a place for people like you, is it?" The words fell like a slap across Aisha's face. Everything around her seemed to stop for a moment. The crowd on the flight faded into the background. Aisha felt that Karen's rejection of her wasn't just a simple remark. It was contempt, disdain, and a subtle racism that Aisha had endured her whole life. But instead of responding immediately, Aisha tried to restrain herself. She didn't want to cause a scene on the plane, didn't want her daughter to witness this ugliness. Nia was still fast asleep, completely unaware of the tension filling the air. Aisha swallowed her anger, deciding not to let Karen and people like her control her life. She sighed, reminding herself that moments like this would never stop happening. She had lived through years of oppression, from the hospital to the societal struggles, where she was never seen as an equal. But today, in this plane cabin, Aisha realized something important. She wouldn't let this happen again. Aisha pulled her bag onto the seat and sat down, trying to maintain her composure, but she couldn't avoid the suffocating feeling swelling in her chest. At that moment, a voice came from the passenger beside her. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Aisha turned to see a middle-aged man looking at her with genuine concern. He didn't look at her with curiosity or judgment. It was the gaze of empathy, an awareness that what she was going through wasn't her fault, but a result of an unjust society. Aisha smiled gently, silently thanking him, but she couldn't shake the anxiety still rising in her heart. A regular flight wasn't just a journey from point A to point B. It was a confrontation with herself, a challenge to everything she had endured. Every flight was like a battle, and this time she had to fight not just for herself, but for her daughter. But that peaceful moment didn't last long. A phone call from another passenger rang out, and like a signal, Karen Whitlock reappeared, standing in the aisle with a challenging look in her eyes. Aisha held her breath, waiting for what was to come. She couldn't escape Karen's sharp gaze. It was as if she were waiting for a reason to make everything worse. And just a moment later, Aisha felt the atmosphere around her grow more suffocating than ever. The flight had begun to soar through the clouds, and Aisha knew this battle was just beginning. But no matter how difficult it would be, she was ready to face it. The flight seemed long, but for Aisha, time passed incredibly slowly. Every sound in the cabin felt like the heartbeat of the life she was fighting for. The suffocating feeling still wouldn't leave her, even though the plane had reached an altitude of 35,000 feet, higher than any worries on the ground. She glanced at her daughter, Nia, who was sound asleep in her arms, her little face like an invaluable source of encouragement, the only reason she kept going. But in a distant place, in a world unseen, Karen Whitlock lingered in Aisha's mind. The disdainful glances, the cruel words from Karen kept repeating in her head. Every time she remembered, it felt like a fresh wound in her soul. But Aisha knew she couldn't let these feelings control her. She was too familiar with the discrimination and violence she had faced, from the hospital to the career opportunities that were taken away from her simply because of the color of her skin. She couldn't let Karen and people like her win. As the plane flew past fluffy white clouds, another image appeared in Aisha's mind. Images of her new job, of the opportunities Seattle promised. It was a life without discrimination, no longer being pushed aside. Aisha sighed, wanting to believe in the future, but the haunting memories of the past were not so easily erased. Never had she felt such deep injustice, where even a small mishap on a flight could turn into a life-or-death struggle with this society. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps from the back of the cabin interrupted Aisha's thoughts. She looked up and saw Karen approaching. Her gait was like that of a predator, and her sharp eyes like a knife, ready to cut through any obstacles. Aisha could feel the hostility in every step Karen took, as if she was determined not to let Aisha be at peace, not letting her have a single moment of rest. "Are you sure you don't need any help?" Karen asked, her voice firm with an undertone of disdain. Aisha looked up, meeting Karen's gaze. A tense feeling rose inside her. Though the words were soft, they were full of contempt, just an excuse for Karen to keep digging into the weakness she thought Aisha would reveal. Aisha knew this wasn't just a simple question. It was control, oppression, and discrimination. "Thank you, I'm fine," Aisha replied. But her words weren't strong enough. Though she wanted to remain calm, deep down, part of her wanted to stand up, shout, and tell Karen to leave her alone. Aisha wanted to fight back, but she knew that this rebellion could scare her daughter. That wasn't how she wanted Nia to see her. A resilient mother, not a woman oppressed and crushed by discrimination. Karen smirked, as if she'd found a weakness in Aisha. "If you're feeling tired, I can help you a little," she said, her tone suddenly turning unnervingly sweet, but Aisha recognized it immediately as a trap, a game Karen was playing to make her feel unworthy. A long silence passed. Aisha didn't say anything further. She just looked at Karen with cold, determined eyes. In that moment, she didn't just see Karen. She saw all the people who had judged her, all those who had made her feel small and insignificant. But today, no one could make Aisha submit. "Thank you. I don't need help," Aisha said again, her voice stronger this time. She didn't want to continue facing Karen, didn't want the battle to go any further. But that's when she realized that only resilience could help her escape from people like Karen. Karen turned around, but her gaze lingered on Aisha, as if trying to remember the image of someone weak. Aisha didn't look back, but she knew that she had taken the first step in this fight, not with words, but with attitude. She wouldn't let anyone cross her boundaries anymore. At that moment, Nia woke up. She smiled, looking at Aisha with innocent eyes, unaware that her mother was facing a battle much greater than anything she could comprehend. Aisha hugged her daughter tightly, kissed Nia's forehead, and whispered, "I'm fine, sweetheart. I will do everything to keep us safe." The anxiety still clung to Aisha, But she knew that she had done something important. Though this challenge had just begun, Aisha had already stood up, and with the determination in her eyes, no one could stop her now. The plane glided through the clouds, and everything seemed to blur, the space outside like a never-ending white canvas. Aisha looked out the window, her mind still unable to break free from what had happened. Though Karen Whitlock had left, the tension inside her never eased. Every movement of Karen, every word she spoke, felt like a knife cutting into Aisha's soul. The feeling of humiliation seemed impossible to erase, but the only thing Aisha could do was keep going. She had to be stronger, for her daughter, for herself. Nia was still sitting beside her. The little girl had fallen back asleep after waking up earlier, her eyes squinting as the faint afternoon light streamed through the airplane window. Aisha looked at her daughter, her heart lightened just a little when she saw Nia peacefully asleep amidst all the chaos. But just as she thought she could calm down for a moment, another storm was preparing to crash. Aisha began to hear whispers from the passengers around her. She tried to ignore them, but then one of them spoke. A middle-aged man sitting near her turned to speak softly, as if not wanting to draw attention, but enough for Aisha to hear. "Excuse me, I don't want to bother you, but I think you're going through a tough time." His voice was filled with concern, but Aisha could detect hesitation in his every word. She looked at him, then gave a slight smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But her words couldn't hide the unease rising within her. At that moment, Aisha realized something she hadn't considered before. Not everyone around her viewed her as a stranger, someone different. But even when there was sympathy, she still couldn't shake off the terrible feelings of racism she faced every day. The plane continued to glide through the hazy space of the clouds and cold air. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier all of a sudden. It felt like the silence was just a veil hiding the simmering tension, the uncomfortable words Aisha couldn't avoid. She couldn't stop thinking about Karen and her attitude. She remembered Karen's sharp gaze, the indifference she had shown toward her, and the contemptuous words she had spoken because of a small incident on the flight. Aisha's mind drifted back to the past, where she had to fight to survive. In the hospital, there were times she stood up against injustice, defending patients' rights, only to be criticized and pushed aside because of her skin color. But this time the struggle was no longer about jobs or careers. It was a relentless battle against those in power, those who had pushed her aside for unacceptable reasons. The worst part was, Aisha couldn't run away. She looked at Nia, who was sleeping soundly, and decided not to let these negative feelings control her any longer. She would face the truth no matter how hard it was. But not everyone could face the truth, and sometimes the words or actions of a person could cause irreparable harm. At that moment, a sound echoed. Aisha realized someone was approaching. Karen Whitlock had appeared again. She stood there like a cold ghost, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Once again, Aisha felt a chill surround her. She wasn't coming to help. She was there to continue controlling, to continue pressing on her. "Please, could you help me for a moment?" Karen's voice rang out, cold and without sympathy. She didn't hide the contempt in her words, and Aisha could feel it. Aisha closed her eyes, a violent wave rising within her. She took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, but the anger inside her couldn't be contained. A part of Aisha wanted to stand up, show Karen that she wasn't someone easily bullied. But then the image of Nia in her heart served as a reminder. She couldn't do that. She couldn't let her daughter witness this violence again. She forced herself to take another deep breath, then spoke calmly, though each word was weighted with restraint. "I don't need help." She didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want things to escalate any further. But in that moment, Aisha understood that no matter whether she stayed silent or reacted, the only thing she could do was stand her ground. Karen didn't respond immediately. She stood there, her gaze still challenging, as if waiting for Aisha to bow her head. But Aisha, though it was difficult, maintained her composure. She knew that this was the only way to retain respect for herself and her daughter. Finally, Karen turned away, leaving Aisha alone in the cabin. But even though the confrontation had ended, Aisha knew the storm wasn't over. Karen's words still lingered like a wound in her heart, and all Aisha could do was keep fighting, not only for herself, but for Nia, the one person she wanted to protect from this world. Aisha sat down, her heart heavy. She knew this challenge was not just about a flight. She had entered a battle with no way to turn back. But one thing she knew for sure: she would not stop. She would fight for respect, for fairness, and most importantly, for her daughter. Aisha was ready for a battle that would not be easy. The long flight was just the beginning of a fight with herself, with those who had mistreated her. She had hoped that once the plane took off, things would ease. But when she looked down at Nia, her little daughter, the feeling of anxiety still wouldn't go away. She knew if she didn't stand up, if she didn't fight, everything would repeat itself. All of her hopes, all her desires to seek justice, would be buried under the weight of injustice forever. However, as the plane soared above the foggy clouds, the tension in Aisha's body began to rise, a truth she couldn't deny. This journey wasn't just a regular flight. It was a real battle against people, systems, and life itself that had tried to defeat her for so many years. At this moment, the hum of the airplane engines, the cold light from the cabin lights, everything seemed to fade away. Aisha could only hear her own breath, the shuffle of passengers moving, but nothing could calm the anxiety in her heart. The flight lasted for hours, and every passing second felt like falling into a spiraling abyss with no way out. The situation began to intensify when Aisha felt the gazes of the passengers around her. Some may not have noticed her presence, but Aisha knew who was watching her. She could feel the judgment from the eyes behind her, the whispers that she couldn't stop. It was a feeling she had grown used to, but this time it was stronger than ever. She no longer felt alone facing racism. No, she no longer wanted to stay silent. A cold gust of wind passed through the cabin, and a middle-aged man sitting nearby turned to look at her. Unlike the others, he looked at her not with curiosity, but with eyes full of understanding. This gaze wasn't intrusive, but rather a subtle form of shared empathy. A silent recognition that, in this difficult moment, Aisha wasn't facing it alone. In those seconds, she knew she had found an ally, someone who could see beyond the societal prejudices. But just then a sharp noise broke the moment. Aisha turned and saw Karen approaching once again. Karen's gaze was sharp as a knife, her eyes unable to hide the hatred. Aisha couldn't avoid the feeling of being scrutinized, being belittled. Each step Karen took was a challenge, a declaration that she wouldn't allow Aisha any peace during this flight. Karen stopped in front of Aisha, her eyes locked on her, lips pressed tightly like a sharp blade. "What are you doing here? Do you think you deserve to sit with people who belong in this cabin?" Karen's question rang coldly, as if she were evaluating every word, every action of Aisha. Aisha didn't say anything, just took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Every word from Karen felt like a stab to her heart, but she knew that if she reacted now, it would only escalate things further. Right now, her focus was on her daughter, not confronting Karen. She wanted to protect Nia, not let her daughter witness this, not let Nia see her mother fail. But suddenly Aisha felt a strength within her awaken. She was tired of accepting the brutal blows from this society. Every time she faced discrimination, she had to stay silent and accept it, but this time Aisha couldn't do that. Her eyes lit up with determination, and when Karen looked into her eyes, Aisha knew she had decided not to yield. She stood up, straightened her back, and looked directly into Karen's eyes. Though her hand still clenched her handbag, the confidence in Aisha's gaze made Karen take a step back. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Aisha said, her voice calm but powerful. "You don't have the right to tell me where I belong." Karen hesitated, a hint of surprise showing on her face. She stood frozen for a moment, then scoffed, but couldn't maintain the smugness she once had. Karen turned away, her footsteps echoing through the cabin, but Aisha's eyes stayed fixed on her until she was completely out of sight. After a long while, Aisha turned back to her daughter. Nia was still sitting quietly, her eyes dreamy, unaware of what was happening. Aisha bent down, gently stroking Nia's hair, then whispered into her ear, "I will protect you. I will do everything to ensure we live in a better world." Aisha's feelings now weren't just exhaustion. It was pride, a belief that she had won a small battle in this war. But the storm was far from over. She knew that this was just the beginning, and her biggest challenge wouldn't come from people like Karen. It would come from a system deeply embedded in society, from those sitting on seats of power, those who still saw her and her daughter as inferior. Aisha's story was becoming more and more intense. What do you think of Aisha's decision? Leave your comments below this video, and don't forget to hit like if you find this story meaningful. Subscribe to continue following the next parts. Aisha sat back in her seat, her heart filled with a strange sensation, both relief and heaviness. She knew that, even though she had won a small battle, the larger fight was still ahead. But one thing she knew for sure: she would not stop. She would fight for respect, for fairness, and most importantly, for her daughter. The flight continued to glide through the sky, but Aisha no longer felt the peace she had hoped for. Though Karen was no longer directly confronting her, the tension still clung to her. In the moments earlier, when the plane had first taken off, she had hoped everything would fade away. But in this quiet space, everything became overwhelming. Aisha tried not to focus on it, but she couldn't deny the rising anxiety in her heart. She looked at Nia, still fast asleep beside her, her tiny hands wrapped around a pillow, her messy hair falling over her forehead. That image was the only motivation that kept Aisha strong. No matter how many times she faced pain and injustice, a part of her knew she couldn't step back. Not just for herself, but for her daughter. Aisha understood that this battle would not be easy. There was no easy escape. Suddenly, a cold breeze passed through, and the crew's announcement broke Aisha's train of thought. The flight had entered a clouded region, and the stillness in the cabin quickly became a source of looming dread. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by Karen or anyone else on the plane, but by something invisible, a force that enveloped the entire space. This oppressive feeling reminded her of the battles at the hospital. Aisha had done everything to protect patients' rights and fight for justice, but racism had stripped her of everything she deserved. And now she was facing an even greater force, one not just embodied by Karen or the passengers on the plane, but an entire system that had been built over time, with an invisible power that she couldn't easily erase. While Aisha was overwhelmed with these thoughts, an unusual sound broke the silence from the back of the cabin. She turned and saw a man standing up, walking toward her. He looked at her hesitantly, but it seemed like he wanted to say something. Aisha felt a bit anxious, but she also noticed something different in his gaze. He wasn't looking at her the way others had, with coldness or disdain. That feeling made Aisha pay attention. As he approached, Aisha became slightly tense. This man wasn't an ordinary stranger. He was wearing a sharp black suit, but what made Aisha feel different was the way he looked at her. He didn't seem nervous or hesitant, as if he'd been observing her for a while. "Sorry, I don't want to bother you, but can I help with anything?" His voice wasn't loud, but clear enough for Aisha to hear. Unlike Karen, this man seemed genuine. Aisha frowned, looking directly into his eyes. Though she didn't say it, she could sense sincerity in his question. But what made her uneasy was not knowing what he wanted. In this situation, caution was the most important thing. "No, it's fine. Aisha replied, but her voice still carried hesitation. She didn't want to get involved in any more trouble, didn't want any further intervention that could escalate the tension. However, the man didn't give up. He looked at Aisha again and then gently said, "I know you're facing something unfair, and if you need help, I can assist. But I just want to say sometimes people are willing to stand by you." Aisha looked at him for a moment, the caution inside her slowly fading. Though she didn't want to easily trust anyone, the man's words seemed to hold a special kind of power. Maybe it was because he said what she had been thinking, things no one on this flight seemed to understand. Aisha felt a part of her being relieved. She didn't respond immediately, but silently nodded, thanking him with a knowing glance. This man couldn't be the one to change everything for her, but at least he made her feel that she wasn't fighting alone. She turned back to look at Nia, her gaze filled with love and determination. Her daughter remained the driving force for her to keep going, to never give up, no matter how cruel the world might be and how many challenges it threw her way. Soon after, as the plane prepared to land, Aisha felt a change within herself. Though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew she was no longer the weak woman she once was. She wouldn't let anyone or anything stand in her way in this fight. Aisha knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face the next challenges. The determination in her heart had been strengthened, and although discrimination still existed, she believed she would find a way to overcome it. Not just for herself, but for Nia, and for all the women, all the mothers who had to fight to protect their children and reclaim their rightful place. The storm was far from over. Although Aisha had faced Karen Whitlock in the airplane cabin, the woman she thought she had overcome, her real challenge had only just begun. As the plane landed in Seattle, Aisha couldn't help but feel that this flight was only a small part of the long, arduous journey ahead. But she was no longer the weak woman she had been when she boarded the plane in Atlanta. She was stronger, more confident, and most importantly, she had realized one thing. She couldn't do it all alone. After leaving the airport, Aisha and Nia were taken to a safe place. She had never felt such peace in a long time. Everything around them was still filled with challenges, barriers she needed to overcome. Nia looked up at her mother with innocent eyes, unaware of the tension and dangers her mother was facing. Aisha wrapped her arms around her daughter, gazed into her eyes, and whispered that everything would be okay, even though deep down she wasn't entirely sure. "We're in Seattle now, baby," Aisha said, trying to keep her voice from betraying the anxiety. "We're going to start over." Nia looked up and smiled a little. "Mom, I love Seattle. I want to go play with you." Aisha smiled tiredly, but she couldn't hide the love in her eyes. Nia was everything to her. Every decision, every action she had made was for her daughter. They entered a small room in a hotel as the evening began to fall. This was the only place they could stay for now. Aisha knew she couldn't stay here long, but at least it was somewhere they could temporarily escape the looming threats. She let Nia play with the new toys she had bought for her while she tried to contact her brother, Derek, a well-known lawyer in the civil rights community. Derek had always been someone she could trust, and now she needed him more than ever. Aisha called Derek. The familiar deep voice of her brother answered the phone. "Aisha, are you okay?" Derek asked immediately when he picked up, his voice filled with concern. "I'm safe, Derek, and so is Naya, but I'm not sure how long we can stay safe without help," Aisha replied, her voice starting to choke. "Karen and people like her don't stop. I need your help." Derek was silent for a moment, then answered firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all those who are oppressed. I'll find a way to investigate and hold them accountable." Aisha felt a wave of reassurance, even though she knew everything was still far from over. The one thing she had found was an ally, someone who wouldn't abandon her in this fight. And that was exactly what Aisha needed right now. The next morning when Aisha woke up, Nia was still sleeping soundly beside her. She looked at her daughter, then gazed out the window. The sky in Seattle wasn't as oppressive as the heat of Atlanta, but it didn't offer her any relief either. She knew that the challenges were still waiting ahead, and the important thing was to be ready to face them. Aisha went outside for a walk to breathe in the fresh air of the city, but as soon as she stepped out of the hotel, she could immediately feel the eyes of those around her. Some people looked at her as if she were a stranger, someone who didn't belong here. But Aisha no longer felt weak. Those looks no longer hurt her like they used to. She knew that this battle wasn't just about regaining justice for herself, but about reclaiming the right to live, the right to freedom, for all those like her. When Aisha returned to the hotel, she realized that safety was only temporary. The dangers were always lurking, and once she had stood up, people like Karen and larger forces would never leave her alone. She received a call from an unidentified source. On the other end, a cold voice spoke, "You won't escape what you've caused. We've seen everything. Don't think you can avoid us." Aisha stood still for a moment, a chill running down her spine. The voice sounded like a direct threat from those who were behind Karen and other dark schemes. But a part of her wasn't afraid. She was ready. Yes, she might not be able to avoid everything, but she didn't regret her decision. If she had to face them, she would. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The hostility didn't just come from Karen, but from organizations and powers protecting their control. Aisha had to go further, had to prove that she wasn't just a victim, but someone who would rise to change everything. With determination in her eyes, Aisha looked back at Nia, then whispered, "We'll get through this, sweetheart." Aisha understood that this fight had just begun. The flight had brought her to a new place, but it wasn't the escape. It was the first step in an uncompromising battle. The ones who had caused her pain wouldn't back down easily. But with unwavering determination, Aisha knew she would fight until the end to protect what mattered most in her life, her daughter and herself. The night in Seattle was never silent. The noises from the street still echoed from afar, with cars speeding by under the dim streetlights. The room where Aisha and Nia were temporarily staying wasn't large, but it was enough for them to feel safer than in other places. However, that safety wouldn't last long. Everything seemed to pause, waiting for a storm that hadn't truly passed yet. The next morning, Aisha woke up to the light streaming through the window, falling on the bed where Nia still slept soundly. She gently got out of bed, not wanting to disturb her daughter's sleep. Those short moments of sleep for Nia were the rare times Aisha had to witness her daughter growing up in a world full of challenges and injustice. As Aisha walked into the hotel room to review the documents and contact Derek, her phone buzzed. She saw a message from an unknown number. It was a call from her brother, Derek. "Derek," Aisha said, answering the phone as she opened the hotel room window to let in the fresh air of the city. "I'm preparing everything," Derek's voice came through, full of determination. "Don't worry, you won't have to fight alone. I found strong evidence against Karen and those involved. They can't escape." Aisha nodded, even though Derek couldn't see it. She still felt comforted by his words. What Derek was doing, the plans he had prepared for her, were the support she needed right now. But a part of her still couldn't feel completely at ease. "You're right," Aisha replied. "We need to make solid moves. Karen isn't just my problem. She's part of a larger system that we need to defeat." Derek didn't respond immediately, but his voice was firm as he continued, "We will bring everything to light. But you have to be careful. They won't give up easily." The conversation was brief, but it was enough to give Aisha more confidence. She understood that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about justice, about exposing the dark corners of society that had been hidden for too long. But perhaps it was still just the beginning. After hanging up, Aisha felt a heaviness in her heart like never before. A part of her knew that even though she had Derek by her side, the road ahead was still filled with unpredictable challenges. She couldn't forget Karen, couldn't forget what she'd caused for her and her daughter. But at this moment, Aisha realized something more important. She wouldn't give up. She turned back to look at Nia, her little daughter still asleep, holding on to her pink pillow. The sight gave Aisha the strength to continue. Her daughter was the only motivation she had, the reason she couldn't fall. When Nia woke up, the light outside the window had softened. The little girl smiled when she saw her mother, her sleepy eyes still full of innocence. "Mom, where are we going today?" Aisha smiled, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "We're going to a new place, a safer place," she replied, her voice gentle but full of determination. But when Nia turned away, her eyes suddenly caught a letter on the table. Aisha felt something was wrong. The sense of insecurity rose within her, a reminder that the storm was still not over. She opened the envelope and found a letter from an unknown source. It contained a few dark lines written clearly. "We won't stop until you kneel. Don't think you can escape us." The threat made her shudder. Aisha couldn't deny that fear was creeping in, but instead of being subdued, she felt her resolve strengthen. This wasn't the first time she'd been threatened, but this time she wasn't afraid. She gripped the letter tightly, her eyes full of determination. "No one will stop me. Even if I have to sacrifice everything, I will fight," she told herself, then put the letter away and turned back to look at Nia. The feeling of safety, which had seemed to come so recently, suddenly vanished. Aisha knew that her enemy wasn't just Karen, but a vast network of power, people who would never want to see her rise, never want to see justice served. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear take control. She had awakened an inner strength within herself, and now it was time to fight. Aisha realized that everything she had been through wasn't enough to prepare her for the challenges ahead. She wasn't just facing Karen, but a power system and people who didn't want to see justice done. But she couldn't step back. She would continue to fight for Nia and for everything she had lost. The threats couldn't make her afraid. She was ready. The battle was never easy, but Aisha had learned how to face danger. Each challenge, every time she was mistreated, made her stronger. Although the threat from the malicious people still lingered, the light of hope inside Aisha never extinguished. She knew this battle wasn't just her own. It was for all those who had been oppressed and forgotten in society. The next day, Aisha stepped out of the hotel, her eyes shining with determination. Although there were still dark paths ahead, she was ready to face it all. Nia held her hand, her innocent eyes the only comfort in this ever-changing world. Aisha smiled at her daughter, even though she was still worried about what was to come. Derek had contacted her early in the morning, telling her he had found some important information about Karen and those involved in her network. There was no time to hesitate now. It was when Aisha realized that she had to be stronger than ever, not just to protect Nia, but to prove that the evil people could not win over justice. Meanwhile, Karen Whitlock continued her schemes. After being fired from Pacific Sky Airlines, she didn't stop. Her calls to those in positions of power continued, and Aisha knew that these were preparations for another attack. But this time Aisha wouldn't be passive. She had gathered strong evidence, and with Derek's help, she wouldn't let them gain the upper hand. Aisha realized that in this battle, every move had to be strategic. She couldn't rely solely on her strength. She needed to figure out how to defeat the power network that Karen and people like her had built. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about a ruthless system that had dominated society for far too long. When they arrived at a small cafe in downtown Seattle, where Derek and his team of lawyers had arranged to meet, Aisha felt the tension in the air. She knew things were getting more serious than ever. Derek's calls and meetings had brought them face to face with a far greater power than she had imagined. Derek and his team of lawyers had been working tirelessly, looking for weaknesses in Karen's system and her associates. They had discovered that beyond manipulating information and relationships in the airline industry, Karen and those behind her had connections to some individuals in the police force and other powerful organizations. This was a network that, if not broken, would prevent Aisha from escaping. "We need to act quickly before it's too late," Derek said, his voice full of determination. Aisha looked at him, her eyes fixed on the relationship map that Derek's team had drawn up. "If we can't break it from the inside, we'll make the truth known to society," she said, her voice filled with resolve. When the meeting ended, Aisha and Derek returned to the car, preparing for the next important step. They knew there was only one choice now: to confront Karen and those behind her directly. As soon as they got into the car, an unexpected call came through. On the other end, a hoarse, threatening voice spoke. "Do you think you'll win?" The voice echoed, cold and challenging. "You can't defeat us. We've been here for a long time, and we won't let someone like you ruin everything." Aisha stood still for a few seconds, feeling a chill run down her spine. This voice sounded like a direct threat from those who were behind Karen and other dark schemes. But part of her wasn't afraid. She was ready. Yes, she might not be able to avoid everything, but she didn't regret her decision. If she had to face them, she would. She took a deep breath, then replied with unwavering conviction, "What comes will go. And when it's my turn, I'll bring justice to those who deserve it." She hung up the phone, and together with Derek, they drove off. They knew this battle wasn't simple. It was a struggle not just for justice, but for the right to live, the right to freedom for all those who were oppressed. And if it took sacrificing everything, Aisha was ready. They didn't speak for the rest of the journey. In just a few hours, they would have to make decisions that could change their lives forever. A battle not just for Aisha, but for anyone who stood up against injustice. A fight that they had to carry on to the end, even if they had to face the powers that be, those who had no conscience. When they arrived at the next meeting place, Aisha realized that everything was heading in the right direction, but she knew this battle wasn't over. Everything was still ahead. Aisha looked out the window, her heart filled with determination. She no longer felt fear, even though she knew the challenges would never end. But she also realized that no one could stop her once she had decided to fight. She was ready to face it all, and she would never stop until the truth was revealed and justice was served. The light of Seattle began to glimmer in the sky as Aisha and Derek arrived in front of the courthouse. This was the pivotal moment where all the sacrifices, all the relentless battles, would finally lead to a result. Nia had been taken to a safe place, and Aisha couldn't let anything make her waver in this moment. Everything had come to a head. This battle wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had stood up against injustice, for all those who had been robbed of their right to live and their freedom. Aisha stood before the courthouse door, taking a deep breath. She no longer felt fear. The tension had become a part of her. Everything she had faced throughout this journey had made her stronger, tougher. The sleepless nights, the constant struggles, all of it had led to this moment. As she stood waiting in the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind. She turned and saw Derek, the one who had always been there for her. His eyes lit up with determination, but in those eyes Aisha also saw worry. Worry not because they lacked the ability to win, but because he understood the forces they were up against. This was a battle not just for justice, but a battle of conscience and power. "Are you okay?" Derek asked, his voice gentle yet full of care. Aisha nodded, not saying anything more. She only needed to feel the steadiness in his gaze. She knew they would overcome everything together. "We're going to win, you know?" She smiled faintly, but in that smile was an unshakable resolve. When the courthouse door opened, Aisha walked in, her heart filled with determination. Before her was a cramped space, filled with eyes, strangers watching her every move. They were the witnesses, the ones who had seen the pain, the suffering she had endured. And now all Aisha had to do was prove that she was right, that she had fought for justice and her right to live. Sitting on the bench, Aisha felt the weight of the eyes around her. In her mind, the accusation still echoed as a reminder of the injustice, but she didn't let it affect her. She knew that now all the lies would be exposed and the truth would prevail. Derek stood up and began his speech. He spoke about racism, about everything Aisha had endured, and about the necessity of standing up against these dark forces. He wasn't just speaking for Aisha. He was speaking for all the oppressed, the ones who had never had a chance to speak out. Aisha Monroe is not just a victim, she is a hero, and her fight is all of ours, Derek said, his voice strong and unwavering. Aisha couldn't help but feel moved. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for all those who had been looked down upon, oppressed. And now, she was standing up, not just for herself, but for all those who had never had a chance to speak. The trial went on throughout the day, but as night fell, everything became clear. The evidence that Derek and his team had gathered had illuminated everything. Karen Whitlock, the one who had caused so much harm, now had nowhere to hide. She was charged with racism, abuse of passengers, and countless damages. When the verdict was read, Aisha stood still, her heart pounding. The verdict echoed in the silence, but all she could feel was a relief she couldn't describe. Karen Whitlock was convicted, and justice had finally been served. Despite this victory, Aisha knew the battle wasn't over. This was just one part of the long journey she still had ahead. The dark forces didn't just exist in Karen and her network, but at least she had secured an important victory. A victory not just for her, but for all those who were oppressed and held down. As soon as the verdict was read, Aisha felt a new wave rise within her. It was strength, resilience that she had honed over many years. And now she was no longer the weak woman that Karen and people like her had thought. When Derek looked into her eyes, he didn't need to say anything more. They had weathered the storm together, and now everything was clear. She no longer had to live in the shadows. She was a hero, and her story would be a lesson for all those who ever thought they could strip others of their right to live and be free. Aisha's battle wasn't over, but she had won an important victory. She hadn't stood up just for herself, but for all those who had never had the chance to speak. Aisha's story would always be a reminder that no matter how many hardships we face, as long as we persevere and have courage, we can change an unjust system.